This is week 188 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. As a side note, today also happens to be the 2-year anniversary of Russia's strike on the village of Zaporizhzhia in Kharkiv Oblast, which killed 59 people when an Iskander missile hit the funeral of a serviceman. Those 59 people killed made up about half of the village's population at the time, and the local cemetery had to be expanded by a third of its previous size. All victims were civilians, and this attack stood out as a particularly brutal example of Russia's indiscriminate murder of Ukrainians. In the wake of 19 Russian drones entering and being shot down in Poland's airspace several weeks ago, unidentified drone sightings have been reported in Denmark, Finland, Norway, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. They've been spotted flying over airports, energy infrastructure, and military bases. And more voices, from Hungary's Russian-friendly prime minister to the head of Ryanair, are calling to shoot them down. So these sightings aren't of the type of attack drone that Russia frequently launches against Ukrainian cities, the kind that smash into buildings and kill large numbers of civilians, but rather surveillance drones intended to collect information and stoke fear. The vast majority of these incidents are inconclusive. A drone will be spotted somewhere that drones are definitely not allowed to be flying. Panic ensues, often in the form of airport closures and police investigations, but the drones themselves don't detonate or leave other physical evidence. So in this way, Russia is testing the response times, coordination, and vulnerabilities of NATO air defense without technically committing an act of war. It's hybrid warfare rather than direct confrontation, and no one is really sure how to define it or how to defend against it. So how did these drones get so far into Europe undetected? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky suggested that the answer might lie in Russia's so-called shadow fleet, a network of up to 1,000 oil tankers and other maritime shipping vessels that Moscow has used to circumvent sanctions on energy exports and continue operating in international waters. According to Zelensky, these vessels are now doubling as mobile drone launch platforms, which means the drones are transported from Russia via the Baltic Sea and launched at Northern Europe from close range. The allegation is particularly significant because the Shadow Fleet operates in a legal gray zone, often sailing under flags of convenience and with deliberately obscured ownership, in waters where no single country has jurisdiction. Their presence in bodies of water like the Baltic is difficult to police, and their cover as commercial shipping vessels makes it hard to detect which ones might be carrying drones, or how retaliation could be carried out even if this was determined, because, as you can imagine, there are vastly different rules of engagement for military versus civilian objects. On Monday, French authorities intercepted a ship that had departed from the Russian port of Primorsky a week before. The ship's route through the Baltic Sea and along the coast of Denmark coincided with drone sightings in corresponding parts of the country. It was in the waters off of Copenhagen when drones forced a closure of Copenhagen Airport, and it was traveling down the country's west coast when drones were sighted there several days later. France and Denmark haven't stated publicly whether their probe into this vessel is tied to these drone sightings, but the captain and first officer remain in custody. French President Emmanuel Macron said on Thursday that the ship was indeed part of the Shadow Fleet, and its crew had behaved belligerently when French authorities boarded. But he couldn't say definitively whether it was connected to the drone sightings. On Wednesday, European leaders agreed to accelerate plans for a drone wall, which is a network of integrated detection and interception systems stretching across the continent. This initiative was first proposed by the understandably nervous Baltic states following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's finally gaining support further west, although key players in Central and Southern Europe remain dubious of whether its rollout would be beneficial for all of Europe and not just the countries bordering Russia. Like in the case of anti-personnel mines and so many other defensive treaties, it's easy to equivocate when you have a physical buffer, something that Eastern European countries aren't afforded. Like I said, these drones aren't attacking, at least for now. They're gathering intelligence, testing NATO's defenses, and sowing anxiety across Europe, especially in the countries bordering Russia, but also further west. When asked during a panel discussion why he's sending drones to Europe, Putin responded jokingly that he'll stop, before denying Russian involvement and comparing the sightings to UFOs. He then threatened to deploy troops to the Finnish border and called NATO a paper tiger, an insult levied just last week by US President Donald Trump at Russia. In short, as tensions rise across Europe, Russia's response is basically, "I know you are, but what am I?" The Kyiv Independent is a reader/viewer-funded news outlet, meaning that shows like this are only made possible by viewers like you. If you'd like to join our community of more than 20,000 members, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. It's an unfortunate fact that prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the main things that the average Westerner knew about the country was that it was home to the single worst nuclear disaster of all time, the 1986 meltdown of reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is about 80 miles north of where I'm sitting right now in the capital. The meltdown released 400 times the amount of radiation as the bombing of Hiroshima, and embodied global fears about nuclear development gone awry. It was a series of mistakes and miscalculations that spiraled into a humanitarian and ecological crisis whose effects will be felt for generations to come. And it was a colossal failure on the part of the government, the Soviet regime in Moscow, to warn the public and contain the disaster before it affected millions in Ukraine, Belarus, and far beyond. The disaster was a warning that humanity might destroy itself with the technology it creates, if caution and diligence fail. So it's with no joy that I say that Russian attacks have caused blackouts at both the defunct Chernobyl nuclear plant and the active Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in south-central Ukraine, the largest nuclear power station in Europe, which has been occupied by Russian forces since 2022. The multi-day blackout at Zaporizhzhia marks the longest continuous external power outage that the plant has endured since the war began, in what President Zelensky referred to as nuclear terrorism that threatens the entire region. In the case of Chernobyl, the ruins of reactor number 4 remain behind a massive steel arch. This steel arch was already damaged when a Russian drone flew into it in February of this year, an event which failed to prompt a firm response from allies, despite the lasting international trauma of the 1986 disaster. Although the plant remains stable, for now, the hole in the protective arch hasn't been repaired, and, due to both logistics and astronomical cost, may never be fully sealable again. Any prolonged power cut to critical ventilation or cooling systems, however, could further erode the structure, allow heat accumulation or chemical reactions, or release radioactive dust into the atmosphere. Zaporizhzhia, with 6 reactors compared to Chernobyl's 4, is an even bigger facility with even higher stakes. The last surviving external line to the plant was severed in September amid heavy strikes, with no safe way for Ukraine or international partners to repair it, forcing the plant to rely entirely on onboard diesel generators. The International Atomic Energy Agency has verified that all 6 reactors remain in a state of cold shutdown, but caution that diesel generators can't keep the plant going indefinitely, with maybe 10 days' worth of fuel reserves before problems arise. Failure to keep the 6 reactors cool could lead to fuel meltdown, hydrogen generation, radioactive release, or a spiraling chain reaction within the plant, which is all a fancy way of saying this is a tightrope in which one wrong move, or one day's delay, could lead to irreversible disaster. And Russia is being anything but cooperative, with Putin saying this week that given Ukraine's ongoing attempts to drive Russian forces out of the Zaporizhzhia plant, Russia is justified in striking the other 3 active nuclear plants that are under Ukrainian control. Russia is testing nuclear norms in wartime, or rather, the lack of red lines regarding something extraordinarily dangerous that's only existed for a handful of decades. The principle that nuclear facilities must not be weaponized or attacked is embedded in treaties and conventions, but no one can agree how to enforce it in situations like these. The UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency have been unable to do more than monitor Ukraine's nuclear plants since the start of Russia's invasion, with Russia declining all calls to vacate the Zaporizhzhia plant. In her book, Voices from Chernobyl, Ukrainian-born Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich said of the 1986 disaster that it was like the war of all wars, with nowhere to hide. Not underground, not underwater, not in the air. Nuclear radiation doesn't respect delineations of airspace or military alliances. A disaster in Zaporizhzhia, or any of Ukraine's other 3 active nuclear plants, is a threat to all of Europe and beyond. For our American viewers, I'd like to alert you to the US premiere of our full-length documentary, Can You Hear Me? The Invisible Battles of Ukrainian Military Medics, which will be hosted at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. at 3 p.m. this upcoming Friday. Co-authored by my colleagues Francis Farrell and Elena Zashko, the film offers a rare and intimate look into the psychological toll of war on Ukraine's military medics. There will be a link to register for the premiere in the description below. Russian forces are incrementally tightening their grip on parts of Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv oblasts. And although overall territorial gains by Russia have been declining since August, the pattern of advancement is strategic, threatening to cut off the supply lines and strongholds that power Ukraine's defense in the east. Analysts with the Finnish Blackbird Group reported that around 10 villages are now occupied in the eastern part of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which lies just west of Donetsk Oblast and north of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, and which hasn't seen occupation until this summer. Ukraine appears to be holding off attempts to push further into the region for now, and with seasons changing, the open field terrain will become harder and harder for Russia to advance in. But the presence of Russian troops in the region could prove effective at disrupting Ukrainian supply lines necessary for the ongoing defense of Donetsk Oblast, as well as stretching Ukraine's manpower and supplies thinner. On the Kupiansk axis in Kharkiv Oblast, a region that's been the site of intense fighting throughout the full-scale invasion, there's far more back and forth between Russian gains and Ukrainian counteractions. Russia occupied just over 36 square kilometers of Kharkiv Oblast in September, while reports indicate that the city of Kupiansk has seen repeated Russian incursions, including one instance of troops trying to covertly break in through the pipes under the city, only to be expelled after. We pushed them back, they came back, we pushed them back again, is how a spokesperson for the 10th Army Corps described the situation in Kupiansk. Like I said in regards to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, these small-scale operations by Russia, as opposed to large-scale assault-based offensives, are only yielding small territorial gains not guaranteed to last long-term, but are successfully wearing Ukrainian resources thin, while eroding the mechanisms by which Ukraine defends its east. To give you a better picture of what reporting from the front lines looks like now, my coworker Francis will take you inside a trench in Donetsk Oblast.
So it's now my 3rd day out here on these positions. It's the longest I've been in one place so close to the front line before, but in the reality of today's battlefield, it's actually not that much. These drone team will spend probably between 2 and 3 weeks in these positions, sleeping in the same place and doing the same job of flying out monitoring the battlefield for Russian activity, and in some cases dropping bombs on them. For us, in the meantime, though, we're looking for a way out, but we're waiting for a vehicle that is available to take us out. Even among Ukraine's best brigades, vehicles have become such a precious rarity, as so many of them are hit on both sides by drones. So there's a lot of important missions to do, bringing people in and out, bringing ammunition in and out, and it's always important to have an armored vehicle at these distances, like the one we came in on. So we're waiting to see when that vehicle will be available, and then we'll get a better idea of when we can leave this place.
For our member question this week, a colleague will chime in.
At present, there is no immediate risk of nuclear catastrophe at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but different experts warned and told the Kyiv Independent that it is still a critical situation. Because now, as the station is disconnected from Ukraine's power grid, it relies solely on diesel generators, and they are not reliable. And also in a long-term perspective, because of Russia's irresponsibility, it could lead to something bad. All 6 reactors at the plant were shut down in spring 2022, when Russia actually occupied the Zaporizhzhia power plant. And as of now, the energy is needed just for cooling these reactors. And if the station will be without electricity, like any potential meltdown would be far less severe than at the Fukushima, for example, because the temperatures inside reactor cores is like significantly lower than it was before. Of course, we cannot predict the reaction of the West in case of a potential meltdown. Probably there will be some condemnations, but even as of now, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, he's visiting Moscow while Zaporizhzhia power plant is still not connected to Ukraine's power grid. Like, he visited Moscow on September 26th, and it was the 3rd day the power plant was disconnected. And President Volodymyr Zelensky also highlighted the big position of Rafael Grossi and the International Atomic Energy Agency.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.